Hello, this is Todd Luck, and I am very pleased to say that according to a Facebook post from Highburn Studios, Jim Shooter, my absolute favorite writer of all time, is returning to comics. And so, Highburn Studios, I've not heard of them before. They seem to be a very small press company. According to the post, Jim Shooter will be writing a title called Guardians, which was created by Highburn editor-in-chief and artist Michael Watkins, and Watkins will be drawing it. Watkins created it when he was in high school and published it in the early 2000s, and it ended in 2004, and he's been working for various different comic companies since then. And so Jim Shooter will be helping to kind of resurrect that concept and get a new series out. And let me read the synopsis that they give for what Guardians is about. And I'll show you artwork from the old series. Keep in mind, this is from 2004, so the artwork will probably look a bit different this time. Guardians reveals the story of men and women, artificially empowered superhumans, gifted with great power or afflicted by it. Some secretly work for the secret military hegemony that created them to protect its interests. They serve, they fight, they sacrifice for what they hope is the greater good. The rest are renegades who despise what the hegemony has done to them, who strive to destroy the Guardians and all they stand for. In an intricate web of secrets, lies, and subterfuge, who are the oppressors and who are the oppressed? So it does sound like definitely something that Jim Shooter could work with and come up with some really interesting stuff. According to the Facebook post, Shooter and Watkins met at Big Lick Comic-Con in Roanoke, Virginia, and this collaboration came out of the discussions that they had there. And so this announcement was posted a month ago, and there hasn't been any reporting on it that I can find, and Jim Shooter has no social media presence that I can find either. So that one post is all I have to go on. And I'm taking Mr. Watkins at his word. But keep in mind that this is comics, and especially small press comics, so anything can happen. But I do hope this project works out, because I'd love to get me some more Jim Shooter comics. So why is Jim Shooter my favorite writer? I think the way Jim Shooter himself talks about it is probably the best way I can describe it. He says he tries to put more thought in his stories than other writers. He tries to live them out in his head. He tries to think through the worlds that he's creating. And he's had such an absolutely incredible career. Jim Shooter began his career when he was just a kid. He wrote Legion of Superheroes in Adventure Comics when he was a teenager. And he created characters like the Karate Kid, Pharaoh Lad, Nemesis Kid, the Sun Eater, the Fatal Five, and the Dominators. And then, of course, he went over to Marvel and he did some really classic work on Avengers, became the editor-in-chief there. He led Marvel Comics in the 1980s during one of the heights of the company's success, and he gave us the first universe-wide crossover, Secret Wars, which he wrote himself and was a fantastic epic story with some interesting insights into the Marvel characters. Toward the end of his tenure at Marvel, he spearheaded a new universe, which was a series of titles with superheroes set in the real world. He ended up writing Starbrand himself with John Romita Jr. doing the artwork, and it was an interesting drama about what would happen if somebody in the real world ended up with superpowers. He would perfect the idea of superheroes in a real-world universe in Valiant Comics in the 1990s. This was one of the best lines of comics ever produced when he was over the company. He wrote most of the titles for the first year and a half. He was ousted from the company after he wrote the Unity crossover, but he has co-writing credits on comics for a couple months after that, and his work can be found in Magnus through issue 24. He then started Defiant Comics, and he wrote Plasm 0 through 4 and Dark Dominion 0. And most of the other comics were written by other writers, though he did get some co-writing credits. But most of them are very good. And just keep in mind, though, that they are leading to a crossover that unfortunately did not happen before the company went under during the bust of the 90s. Jim Shooter would then create yet another universe with Broadway Comics. He would write each of these with the assistance of a writer's room, and they were phenomenal. And the great thing about these is each of them have complete, satisfying plot lines. It is a short-lived but phenomenal line of comics. And that's just some highlights from his career. Jim Shooter's work had a huge impact on my imagination. I started to seriously collect comics in 1989, and I unfortunately found that a lot of the titles I like were getting canceled. I wasn't necessarily connecting with the heroes. I was seeing a lot of redundant stories, a lot of recycled plot lines. And by the time 1991 rolled around, I just was thinking to myself, is this all there is to the superhero genre? By then, Jim Shooter was at Valiant, and when I mentioned that Jim Shooter wrote the first year and a half of Valiant titles, I was talking about the superhero universe. What they actually did before then was Nintendo comics. And while my 12-year-old self found these to be very impressive visually back in 1990, I found the stories to be lacking. They weren't written by Jim Shooter. And then in 1991, at the age of 13, I picked up the first Valiant Universe comic written by Jim Shooter, Magnus Robot Fighter #1. I had never read anything like it before. It blew my mind away. It showed me what comic books could be. The writing and art were on a level I hadn't seen before. It was both the most fantastic comic I'd ever read and the most real at the same time. It introduced me to a fantastic world that I felt like I could just jump into the pages and live in. The characters just had such depth and complexity that I'd never seen before. I identified with Magnus like I hadn't identified with any character in fiction up until that point. The story was deeper and more complex, more imaginative, and more epic than anything I'd ever seen in comic book form. It took me from being a young reader who thought he'd seen all the possibilities of the superhero genre to an aspiring writer who knew the possibilities were endless. And Shooter's work just continued to have such an effect on me. In the 90s, I would create all kinds of superhero universe plots of my own with my own characters. And that's something I still do to this day as a hobby. Never really was able to get into the comic book industry as a creator, but I did pursue writing and art as a professional career, which I still do to this day. So yeah, I'd love to see some more comics from Big Jim. I know, again, anything can happen. There have been projects that have been announced in the past that just didn't happen. Like, he was supposed to write Youngblood and Megalith back in the day. But hopefully, crossing my fingers that this will produce some really cool comics. And I'm definitely looking forward to it. All right, guys, like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.